Arrested as a trespasser, she healed his wolf by midnight. By dawn, he refused to release her. The gate was locked, but Nadia climbed it anyway. She did not stop to think about what would happen if someone caught her. She did not pause at the bottom of the rusted iron fence to read the warning signs bolted across it. She had read enough of those signs in her life to know that they were almost always put there by people who cared more about their property than about what lived and breathed on it. She swung her leg over the top bar, felt the cold metal through the fabric of her jacket, and dropped to the other side with a soft thud. The woodland swallowed her immediately. It was the kind of dark that only exists far from cities. Not the dim, orange-tinted darkness of a street with the lights off, but a real, total darkness that pressed against her from every direction. The trees on Blackwood Ridge were old and tall, and they grew close together, and their branches had long since learned to reach across the gaps between them and hold hands above the path. What little moonlight existed on that October night could not get through. Nadia clicked on her flashlight and kept moving. She had driven 40 minutes to get here. She had left her supper on the counter, and her cat, irritated on the sofa, and her phone ringing with a call she had not answered, because she already knew what it would be. Her sister, calling to ask when she was going to start living like a normal person. The answer, as always, was not tonight. The message had come in at 8:30. A text from an unknown number, short and blunt. Injured wolf on Blackwood Ridge land, northeast corner, near the old stone wall. She had stared at it for 30 seconds. Then she had packed her kit. She was a wildlife rehabilitator. Had been for 11 years. She ran a small licensed facility 20 miles north of here, called the Dunmore Wildlife Center, which she had built from an empty barn and a modest inheritance and an obsession with wild animals that most people found either admirable or strange, depending on who you asked. She had treated foxes and deer and badgers and barn owls and, twice in her career, wolves. She knew what a wolf in a snare looked like. She knew what would happen if one was left there long enough. So she was here, at 10:15 at night, with a medical kit on her back and mud already on her boots, walking through someone else's woodland without permission. The northeast corner was further than she had expected. She followed the text's instruction and kept the old stone wall to her left, pushing through undergrowth that caught at her legs and branches that swung back at her face. The air smelled of wet earth and pine and something else, faintly, that she recognized only because she had spent so many years near wild animals. A thick, warm animal scent that told her she was getting close. She heard him before she saw him. Not a howl. Nothing dramatic. Just a low, rhythmic sound, somewhere between a breath and a groan. The kind of sound a large animal makes when it is trying very hard not to make any sound at all. Nadia slowed. She angled the flashlight down toward the ground, reducing the brightness, and moved more carefully. He was lying against the base of the stone wall, half hidden in the long grass. He was huge, even curled on his side, even with his body low to the ground. She could see that he was a big male, silver-gray coat, thick and winter-heavy, broad head resting on the ground with his chin flat in the mud. His eyes were open, and they caught the edge of her flashlight and reflected it back at her like two small moons. He did not move. She went very still. A healthy wolf would have been on its feet by now, or gone. A healthy wolf would never have let a stranger get this close without at least backing away into the darkness. The fact that he had not moved told her two things. He was in significant pain, and he had been there long enough that his energy was low. She looked at his back leg and found the snare. It was a wire loop, the old-fashioned kind, the kind that tightens the more you pull against it. It had caught his right hind leg just above the joint, and he had pulled against it. She could see that from the way the wire had cut into the fur, from the matted and dark patch that told her the wound was open and had been bleeding. The wire was connected to a metal stake driven into the ground beside the wall. Someone had set this trap deliberately. Here, on private land. Nadia crouched down slowly. She kept her eyes on his face, not on the wound. In her experience, wild animals in pain were not predictable, and a wolf even less so. But she had also learned, over a long career of sitting very still in dark places, next to frightened animals, that they could read stillness in a person. They could feel the absence of threat. She kept her breathing slow and even, and she let him look at her. He blinked. She took that as permission. She set her kit on the ground beside her and unzipped it without looking away from him. She took out her gloves and pulled them on. She took out the wire cutters she always carried, And then, inch by inch, she moved toward the snare. She was halfway through positioning herself when the floodlights came on. It was instant and total. The whole northeast corner of the woods lit up like the middle of the afternoon, every shadow gone in a second. The wolf flinched and scrambled and cried out, a sharp, broken sound, and Nadia threw one arm over his neck instinctively to keep him still, pressing her other hand flat against his side, murmuring low and fast under her breath. She heard boots. More than one pair, coming quickly. She did not move. She kept her hand on the wolf and her voice low. "Don't come any closer," she said it without turning around. "If you come running at this animal right now, he is going to hurt himself worse." The boots stopped. Silence. Then a voice, male, controlled, not shouting, but carrying clearly in the cold air. "Step away from the wolf and stand up." "I'm a wildlife rehabilitator," she said. Still not turning. "He is caught in a snare, and the wound needs attention in the next 30 to 40 minutes, or you are looking at a serious infection. I need you to give me some room and some quiet." Another silence, shorter this time. "Stand up, now." She could hear in his voice that he was not someone who was used to being told to wait. She could also hear that he was not shouting, which meant he was keeping his head, which meant there was a chance she could reason with him. She pressed the wolf's side gently, felt the slow rise and fall of his ribs, and then, carefully, she straightened up and turned around. There were 3 men. 2 of them were in the dark green uniforms of a state security staff, and were hanging back as the man in front had apparently told them to. The man in front was not in uniform. He was wearing a dark wax jacket, and mud-spattered work trousers, and boots that had seen a great deal of use. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from physical work rather than a gym, and he was looking at her, with an expression that was not anger, exactly, but was something close to it. He was also looking at the wolf. She watched his jaw tighten when he saw the snare. "My name is Nadia Osei," she said. "I hold a current license with the National Wildlife Rehabilitation Association. I have my credentials in my kit. Someone sent me an anonymous message tonight telling me there was an injured animal on this land, and I came because that is my job. I apologize for coming without permission. I could not reach anyone to ask." "That wolf," he said, "has never allowed a stranger within 10 feet of him." Nadia glanced back. The wolf's great gray head was still resting on the ground, his eyes half closed. His breathing had slowed again. She looked back at the man. "He is in a lot of pain," she said. "Pain changes things." Something shifted in the man's expression. Not softening exactly. More like a door opening a small amount and then stopping. "Ethan Blackwood," he said. "This is my land." "I know. I am sorry I am on it without your permission." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at the wolf again. Then he said, "What do you need?" And she told him. It took her a moment to fully understand that he was asking seriously, not as a preamble to having her escorted off the property. She had been braced for the second option. She readjusted quickly and ran through what she needed. Quiet, steady light, rather than the floodlights if possible, a clear space around the animal, and for everyone except the 2 of them to stand back. Ethan turned to his security staff and said something low to them. One of them went away and came back with a lantern-style torch that gave off a warm, steady glow without the harshness of the floodlights. The other stood back. The floodlights stayed on, but Ethan stepped in front of the worst of the beam, and the light around the wolf became just bearable. She went back to work. She was aware of Ethan watching her from a few feet away, not hovering, not crowding her, just present. She found that she did not mind it, which surprised her. She was used to people who hovered and people who disappeared, and neither was as useful as someone who stood at a reasonable distance and paid attention. The wire cutters went through the snare in 2 clean cuts. She kept her hand on the wolf as the wire went slack, ready for him to react, but he only exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. She worked the wire free of his leg carefully, peeling back where it had become caught in the fur, and got her first clear look at the wound. It was not as bad as it could have been. The wire had cut into the skin, and there was significant bruising already forming beneath the surface, and there was a section that would need to be cleaned properly and dressed, but the major blood vessels were intact. He had been lucky, or he had been found in time. She was not sure which. She was reaching for the antiseptic wash when Ethan spoke again. "How long has he been here?" Hard to say exactly. A few hours at least, based on the wound. Long enough. He didn't trigger the motion cameras until 8:47. She looked up. Then someone set this trap before nightfall and expected to come back after dark. Ethan said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw moved. She cleaned the wound in stages, working slowly so as not to startle the wolf. He flinched once, hard, when she first made contact with the open tissue, and she felt Ethan take a half step forward behind her, instinctively, before catching himself. She said nothing about that. She cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic, and was considering whether stitches were necessary. They were, in one small section, when she heard footsteps she did not recognize coming through the trees. The constable had arrived. He was a broad man with a sensible face and an unhurried manner that told her he had been doing this job for a long time, in a place where urgency was rarely the right response to anything. He took in the scene: the wolf, the woman with gloves and a medical kit, the landowner standing nearby, and he did not rush toward any of it. Ethan walked to meet him. They spoke quietly, too far away for Nadia to hear. She focused on the wolf. She got the small suture kit from her bag and did the 2 stitches that were needed, quick and clean, and closed the dressing over the top. Then she sat back and put her hand flat on the wolf's flank and felt his breathing. It was steadier now. The panicked, shallow rhythm of before had settled into something slower and deeper. His eyes were still open, watching her. "You're going to be fine," she said quietly. "You've been through worse than this, I think." She did not know if that was true, but she believed it. He had the look of an animal who had survived things, not broken, not defeated, just worn in the way that wild things get worn by a life that does not make allowances for them. She heard footsteps returning, and looked up. Ethan was coming back. The constable was behind him, notebook out, expression neutral. "Ms. Osei," Ethan said. He stopped a few feet away from her, and looked at the wolf. He looked at the clean dressing. He looked at the cut wire lying in the grass. Something moved across his face that she could not quite name. "He's stable," she said. "The wound is clean and dressed. He needs monitoring through the night, and antibiotics tomorrow, and the dressing will need to be changed in 48 hours. He should not be moved tonight. He needs to rest where he is, and be allowed to get up on his own terms when he is ready." Ethan nodded slowly. He was still looking at the wolf. "Ms. Osei," the constable said, from slightly behind Ethan, "I'll need to take your details." "Of course." "You understand that entry onto private land without permission is an offense?" "I do, yes. Mr. Blackwood will need to decide whether he wishes to pursue the matter formally." There was a pause. It was not a long one, but it was long enough to matter. Nadia kept her hands still and her face calm. She had done nothing wrong in the way that counted, but the law was not always interested in the ways that counted, and she was on someone else's land at nearly 11 at night with a medical kit and a set of wire cutters. She waited. Ethan turned his gaze from the wolf to her. He looked at her for a moment that stretched a little longer than a simple decision should require. "Take her details," he said to the constable. Then, to her, "Come with me when you're done." She was not sure, in that moment, whether those words were an instruction or a question. His tone did not give much away, but the wolf chose that exact moment to lift his great gray head and look at her, and then look at Ethan, and then set his chin back down on the ground, with the air of an animal who had made his own assessment of the situation, and was comfortable with the result. Nadia pulled off her gloves and folded them into her kit and stood up. She gave her details to the constable, and then she followed Ethan Blackwood into the dark. She did not know yet what the night held. She did not know what that man was going to say to her when they reached wherever they were going, or what decision he was going to make, or what the morning was going to look like. She only knew that the wolf behind her was breathing evenly, and that his wound was clean, and that she had made it here in time. For now, that was enough. The trees closed in around them as they walked, and the cold air pressed against her face, and somewhere far above the branches, a handful of stars blinked between the clouds, indifferent and bright, watching a woman follow a stranger deeper into his land, without quite knowing why she trusted the silence between them as much as she did. She kept walking anyway. Ethan Blackwood had learned, a long time ago, that the worst things rarely announced themselves. They did not arrive with noise and drama. They did not come with warning signs or flashing lights, or the kind of clear, obvious danger that a person could see coming and brace against. The worst things arrived quietly, in the form of small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. A gate left open, a call not returned, a piece of land left unwatched for a single night. By the time you understood what had happened, it was already done. He had been thinking about this a great deal over the past 6 months. Since the poaching had started, since his head ranger had left, since he had found himself, at 38 years old, the sole custodian of 400 acres of woodland, and one wolf, who trusted nobody on this earth except Ethan himself, and even that trust had limits. He led Nadia Osei across the estate in silence, not the uncomfortable silence of two people who have nothing to say to each other, but the working silence of someone who is thinking hard and needs to do it without noise. She walked behind him and said nothing, and he was grateful for that. His security office was a converted stone building near the main gate, originally a gamekeeper's store from the previous century, now fitted with cameras and a desk and a small wood-burning stove that kept it warm enough to be useful in winter. He held the door open for her. She walked in and set her medical kit on the floor near the door and looked around the room without comment. He pulled out a chair from behind the desk and set it on the near side, facing the desk, and gestured for her to sit. Then he went around and sat on the other side. Between them, on the desk, was a map of the estate, a radio, and a half-drunk mug of tea that had gone cold hours ago. He looked at her properly for the first time, without the distraction of the wolf and the darkness and the immediate emergency to manage. She was younger than he had expected, mid-30s, he guessed. She had the kind of face that was built for concentration, with steady eyes and a directness to her expression that he recognized because he had it himself, and had been told more than once that it made him difficult to talk to. Her hands were on the table in front of her, still, and she was waiting. "You said someone sent you an anonymous message," he said. "Yes, a text, at around 8:30. An unknown number, short, just the location and what was wrong." "Can I see it?" She took her phone from her jacket pocket and turned it toward him without hesitation. He read the message. The number was a string of digits that meant nothing to him. The wording was plain and factual. He took a photo of the number with his own phone. "Someone knew the wolf was there before you arrived." "Yes," she said, which means either whoever set the trap told someone, or someone else was watching the land and saw it before your cameras did. He had already worked this out himself. It was not a comforting thought either way. If the person who had set the trap was talking to people, it suggested a network rather than a single opportunist. If someone else had been on the land without his knowledge, watching, waiting, and then chose to call a wildlife rehabilitator instead of him, the reasons for that choice were not immediately clear. "Why you?" he said. "How did they know to call you specifically?" "The Dunmore Wildlife Center is licensed for wolves," she said. "There are not many facilities in this region that are. If someone looked up wolf rehabilitation in this area, my number would come up." He accepted that. It was logical. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "Q. Ghost has been on this estate for 4 years, he said. He came to me as a pup. His mother was killed by hunters on land to the north of here. I found him in the spring, and I raised him through summer, and when it was clear he was not going to survive a release back to the wild without a support structure, I applied for the relevant permissions and kept him here. He's semi-wild," she said. It was not a question. "He lives on the estate. He has full range of it. He is not kept in an enclosure. He goes where he chooses and comes back when he wants to. I have never been able to handle him the way someone handles a captive animal. He tolerates me. That is the best way I can describe it. And he let me work on him." "He let you work on him?" Ethan paused. "That has never happened before with a stranger. I have had 2 different vets on this land in the past 4 years who needed to do routine checks on him, and neither of them got within 6 feet before he made clear he was not going to cooperate." She considered this. Animals in pain sometimes make different decisions than they would otherwise. The threshold shifts. They become more willing to accept help they would usually refuse. "Maybe," he said, "but that's not all of it." She didn't argue. She seemed to know it wasn't. Ethan had been around animals long enough to understand that they operated on something that was not quite instinct and not quite intelligence, but somewhere in the vast middle ground between the two. Ghost was a perceptive animal. He had survived circumstances that would have ended a less alert creature, and he had done it by being exceptionally good at reading the world around him. The fact that he had gone still under Nadia's hands told Ethan something that the records and the license and the credentials in her kit could not. The wolf had made an assessment. Ethan was still making his. "Tell me about the work you do," he said. "Your facility." She talked for several minutes. He listened. The Dunmore Wildlife Center had been operating for 8 years in its current form. Before that, she had worked for 2 different national wildlife organizations, one in Scotland, one in Wales, after completing a degree in conservation biology, followed by specialist training in animal rehabilitation. The facility currently housed 14 animals in various stages of recovery, from a tawny owl with a healed wing fracture to a young red deer that had been found road injured in spring. She held active licenses for all of them. She employed 2 part-time staff and had a network of volunteers. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, giving facts rather than trying to impress him with them. He found he believed her, not because of the facts themselves, which he could verify, but because of the way she gave them, as though the information was simply available and he was welcome to have it. "The snare," he said, when she finished. "I want to be clear about something. That is not a trap I set or sanctioned. I do not permit snares on this estate. I do not permit any trapping of mammals. The estate is a rewilding project. Whatever that was, it was put there by someone else." "I didn't think it was yours," she said. He looked at her. "The estate is clearly managed for wildlife," she said. "The woodland is good. The undergrowth hasn't been cleared. The old stone walls have been left intact. Someone who understood the value of a working ecosystem made these choices. That is not the profile of someone who sets illegal snares on their own land." He was quiet for a moment. He had not expected that observation. He had expected to have to defend himself, as he often did with people who arrived on the estate without invitation and left with a particular story about what they had seen. "There have been 3 incidents in the last 6 months," he said. "This is the 4th. Before tonight, it was equipment damage and disturbance to nesting sites. Tonight is different. Tonight was aimed at Ghost specifically. The snare was placed exactly where he habitually walks in the late evening. Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Do you have any idea who is behind it?" "I have a theory. I'm building evidence." He paused, deciding how much to say. "There is a man named Colin Ferrer, who owns land adjacent to this estate to the south. He has been attempting to purchase part of Blackwood Ridge for 3 years. I have declined every approach. 6 months ago, his requests became less polite. Shortly after that, the incident started. You think he is trying to make the land untenable?" "I think someone is. Whether it is him directly or whether he has contracted someone to carry out the activity. I do not yet have evidence that would support a formal complaint." Nadia was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on the table. "Someone on his side may have sent me that message," she said slowly. "If the goal was to get someone unauthorized onto your land tonight." Ethan looked at her. He had already thought of this. "That is one possibility," he said carefully. "Which would mean the snare was set partly to draw me here, and the text was sent to make sure I came, and gave someone grounds to file a complaint on your property. A trespass, yes, with a licensed rehabilitator on the record as having entered without permission. If this went to the press rather than a police report, it becomes a story about mismanagement of a protected animal on private land." She absorbed this without visible alarm. "Do you think that's what happened?" "I don't know, but I'm aware it's possible." He looked at her steadily. "Which is why I'm telling you this before the constable comes back in, and you have to make a statement." She held his gaze for a moment. "You're warning me. I'm informing you," he said. "What you do with the information is your decision." The stove crackled in the corner. Outside, through the small window of the security office, the floodlights over the northeast corner of the estate were still on, and in their pale glow, Ethan could just make out the shapes of the 2 rangers he had posted near the wolf. He had not told her yet that he had not decided whether to press the trespass formally. He had not told her what he was going to do. He had not yet entirely decided. He looked at the woman across the desk from him. She was watching the window, as he had been, and she had the expression of someone doing complex mental work, sorting, weighing, calculating. He recognized that too. "He was breathing more steadily when we left," he said. "Not quite a question." She turned back to look at him. "Yes, the wound is clean. The dressing will hold through the night. He needs to stay calm, and not try to walk on it tonight. But if he rests, he should be significantly better by morning." "Will he let my rangers near him?" I don't know. He may not. She hesitated. I could stay until he's properly settled, if that would help. I know that sounds presumptuous, given the circumstances. But if there's any doubt about whether your team can manage him tonight without causing further stress to the wound, I'm willing to stay. Ethan looked at her. Outside the window, the woodland was quiet and cold, and Ghost was lying in the grass near the old stone wall, breathing slowly, resting. In 4 years of living on this estate, Ethan had found the wolf in many states, restless and energetic on the good days, distant and withdrawn on others, but never calm in the presence of a stranger, never still. He thought about what that meant. He had been thinking about it since the moment he had walked up through the trees and seen her kneeling in the mud, with her hand on the wolf's side, and Ghost's great gray head just barely lifted to look at her. He had spent 6 months being let down by people he had employed and trusted to protect this land. He had spent 6 months watching something he had built carefully start to come under pressure from the outside. He was tired, in the way that a person gets tired not from lack of sleep, but from lack of relief, from the constant low weight of being the only person looking after something that mattered. The woman across the desk from him had climbed a locked gate in the dark to help an animal she had never met on land she had no right to enter. He was still deciding what to do about the trespass. But he had already decided something else. "I'll have someone bring you a thermos," he said. "It's cold out there." She looked at him for a moment, as if checking whether he meant it. Then she nodded, picked up her medical kit, and went back out into the night. Ethan stayed in the security office for another few minutes, alone, the cold mug of tea in front of him, looking at the map of his estate and thinking about snares and anonymous messages, and a wolf who had spent 4 years trusting no one, but had made his own decision tonight. Then he picked up his radio and called his ranger and said, "I'm coming back out." He zipped his jacket and went out into the dark after her. Ghost had not been named lightly. Ethan had not been the type to name animals, before Ghost. He had grown up on this land, and had known his share of foxes and deer, and the various birds that came and went with the seasons, but he had understood even as a child that naming a wild animal was a kind of claim, and that making a claim on something wild was almost always a mistake. His grandfather had taught him that. "Keep your distance," his grandfather had said. "Admire from outside. The moment you name it, you start to need it." So the wolf had gone without a name for the first 2 weeks. Ethan had found him in early April, in the northern stretch of the estate, where the woodland thinned, and the land opened into rough grassland that had once been farmed, and was slowly being given back. The pup had been barely 8 weeks old, small enough to fit in Ethan's 2 hands, and so still when Ethan first found him, that he had thought for a moment he was already gone. He had not been gone. He had been hiding. He had been doing the only thing available to him, which was becoming as small and as quiet as possible, and waiting for danger to pass. The name had come on the 3rd night, when Ethan had woken to check on the pup in the barn, and found the corner of the blanket empty, and the pup vanished, and spent 20 minutes searching the building before finding him pressed flat against the wall in a shadow, absolutely motionless, watching Ethan search with what appeared to be calm patience. He had not made a sound. He had been right there the whole time. "Ghost," Ethan had said, very quietly, more to himself than to the animal. The pup had looked at him. And that had been that. He had grown quickly, the way wolf pups do. The early months a blur of rapid change, each week noticeably different from the last, the small, soft creature becoming a young animal with opinions and preferences, and a developing wariness of the world that Ethan had tried very carefully not to disrupt. He had not tried to make Ghost tame. He had not tried to make him pet-like or dependent. What he had tried to do was make the estate a place where Ghost could be fully what he was, without the world outside its borders reaching in and ending him. This was harder than it sounded, because what Ghost was, fundamentally, was a wolf in a country that had no legal framework for wild wolves, and no existing wolf population for him to belong to. He was neither wild nor domestic. He was something in between, a creature who had been shaped partly by his origins and partly by the 4 years of this particular place, and who navigated the estate as though it belonged to him, which in the only way that mattered, it did. Strangers made him dangerous. Not aggressive in the way that people imagined when they thought about wolf behavior, not snarling or charging or looking for a confrontation. Ghost's response to strangers was something colder and more controlled than that. He would go very still, he would watch. And then, if the stranger came too close, or made a sudden movement, or did anything that Ghost's deep and careful internal system classified as a threat, he would move, fast, decisive, committed, and the stranger would find themselves dealing with something that outweighed most of them, and had been living on wild instinct in a functioning woodland for 4 years. Ethan had managed this through a combination of clear boundaries, staff training, and an honest acknowledgement that some situations would simply not be manageable. He could not guarantee Ghost's behavior. He could only guarantee his own, which was to keep the estate as controlled as possible, and to know the wolf well enough to read the signs. Tonight, none of the signs had applied. He had come through the trees expecting to find the wolf in distress, which was bad enough, and had instead found him in a state that Ethan had no category for, which was lying in the mud, wounded, and in pain, with a strange woman's hands on his back, and his eyes half closed, and his breathing slow. He had stood very still and looked at that image for several seconds before he had spoken. In 12 years of working with animals, Ethan had learned to trust what they showed him over what people told him. Animals did not perform. They did not make social calculations. When Ghost lowered his head and let Nadia Osei clean a wound on his leg, he was not being polite or cooperative for the sake of the situation. He was making a judgment that she could be trusted, and he was acting on it without reservation. Ethan had watched that, and then he had made his own judgment about what it meant. Now it was nearly midnight, and the three of them were in the northeast corner of the estate. Nadia sitting a few feet from Ghost on the cold ground, her back against the stone wall, a thermos of tea in her hands. Ethan crouched a few feet to her left, doing the same. And Ghost lying between them and slightly forward, the clean white dressing visible on his hind leg, his eyes open in the darkness. The constable had gone. He had taken Nadia's details and written his report, and said he would await word from Ethan about whether to proceed formally. He had asked if there was anything else needed tonight, and Ethan had said no, and the constable had driven away down the estate lane with the quiet competence of a man who had seen stranger things in this valley, and would see stranger things yet. The 2 security staff were back at the main building. Ethan had told them to go. The rangers were doing a circuit of the estate perimeter, radios on, alert for any sign that whoever had set the snare had returned, or was planning to. Out here, it was quiet. Nadia broke the silence first. What was he like when he was a pup? Ethan looked at Ghost, who was watching a point in the middle distance with the specific, focused quality of attention that meant he had heard or smelled something that had not yet reached human range. Quiet, Ethan said. Even then, most pups are noisy. They whine and scramble and make their needs known. He used to just sit and look at me. The first time I brought a vet out to check him over, the vet said he had never seen a pup that still. Yes, I think so. She turned her mug in her hands. 4 years is a long time to care for something alone. I have staff. That's not what I mean. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It is not. Ghost turned his head and looked at Nadia, then at Ethan, then back at Nadia. His amber eyes were very clear in the torchlight. He's trying to work out what we are to each other, Nadia said quietly, with a slight edge of amusement in her voice. And what conclusion is he reaching? I think he hasn't decided yet. She watched the wolf for a moment. He's not worried about it, though. That's a good sign. Ethan looked at the wolf. He thought about 4 years of nights like this one, or something like this one. Different emergencies, different problems, always the same fundamental responsibility, which was, this animal is in your care, and his well-being is your concern, and no one is going to share that weight with you. He had chosen that. He had not regretted it, but it was still weight. You said your facility handles 14 animals currently, he said. Yes, it changes. The goal is always to release them when they're ready. Ghost is unusual, because release in the traditional sense isn't possible for him. No, he belongs to a species that doesn't have a wild population to return to in this country. How do you manage that? She said. The knowledge that the best outcome for him is still going to be a half-life, in terms of what he is. It was a direct question, and he gave it a direct answer. I try not to think of it as a half-life. He has 400 acres, and he is physically and mentally healthy, and he lives by his own choices within those acres. That is more than most wolves anywhere on this continent have. That's true. Is it a rationalization? Probably, partly. But I have found that when there is no good option, the question becomes which imperfect option causes the least harm, and this one causes him less harm than any other I can make available. She considered that. You think clearly, she said, not flattery. More like an observation. I try to. Most people in your position, finding a stranger on their land at 10 at night, would not have waited to hear an explanation. Most people in your position, he said, would not have climbed a locked gate alone in the dark to help an animal they'd never met. She smiled slightly. It changed her face. He looked away, toward Ghost, and found the wolf watching him, with an expression that could only be described as interested. The snare bothers me more than the trespass, Ethan said, after a moment. I know. Whoever put it there knew exactly where he walks. That kind of knowledge takes time to gather. It means someone has been on this land, observing, for long enough to build up a picture of his movements. Or someone who knows the land, told them. He had thought of that too. Yes. Do you have former staff who might have reason to? My head ranger left in April. His name is Peter Oakes. I don't know his current whereabouts. His departure was not on good terms. He paused. He knew this land well. She said nothing. She let the information sit. He appreciated that. He was not in the habit of sharing this kind of information with people he had known for less than 2 hours. But the night had compressed things in the way that emergencies did, burned through the surface layer of social convention, and left behind something more functional. Ghost made a sound, not loud. A low, soft sound from deep in his chest, almost a hum. Both of them looked at him. He had shifted his position slightly, bringing his injured leg forward onto a more comfortable angle, and his eyes had half closed. He's settling, Nadia said quietly. That's good. That's very good. Ethan watched the wolf. He watched the slow rise and fall of his ribs. He watched the way the tension had gone out of the great gray body, gradually, over the past hour, like something being carefully let down from height. He thought about Peter Oakes and Colin Farrer, and snares, and anonymous messages, and everything that had been building on this estate for 6 months, while he had managed it largely alone. He thought about the paperwork on his desk, and the security cameras, and the formal complaint he had not yet filed, because he did not yet have enough evidence, and the feeling that the walls he had built around this land were being tested from the outside by someone patient and methodical. And then he looked at the woman sitting 3 feet to his right, her back against the old stone wall, her thermos of tea held in both hands, her eyes on the wolf, and he thought about the fact that she had climbed a locked gate in the dark because someone had sent her a message about an animal she had never met, and that the wolf who trusted nobody had trusted her within minutes, and that he himself, who was not exactly known for rapid decisions about people, had made a decision about her within the first 10 minutes that he had not yet reversed. He did not examine that too closely. He let it sit, the way she had let his information about Oakes sit. You should know, he said, after a long quiet, that I don't intend to pursue the trespass. She looked at him. The constable will be told. You'll receive the formal caution, but no further action will follow. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you. Don't thank me. You came here to help my wolf, and the fact that you had to climb a gate to do it says more about how tonight unfolded than about your intentions. She nodded. She looked back at Ghost. Ethan looked back at Ghost too. The wolf was breathing long and slow in the darkness, his eyes almost fully closed now, his great body relaxed against the cold ground. The wound was clean, and the night was quiet, and he was, for the first time in hours, at rest. Above the trees, a gap had opened in the clouds, and a few stars were showing. Not many, just enough. Ethan poured the last of his tea and sat back against the stone wall and let the quiet hold. There was still a great deal to manage. There was still the question of who had set the trap and why, and the investigation that would follow, and the estate to protect and the work to continue and the morning that would arrive with its own demands. But for now there was this, a cold night, and a fire-bright thermos, and a wolf at rest in the October dark, and the sound of the woodland settling into itself around them, and the particular silence of a situation that has come through the worst part and arrived at something steadier. It was not an answer. It was a pause. But sometimes, Ethan had learned, a pause was enough. The zip ties were not cutting into her wrists. Nadia noted this carefully, because it was the kind of thing that would matter later. They were tight enough to hold, but they had been applied without malice, and the constable had apologized as he put them on. She had said it was fine. It was not exactly fine, but it was not the worst thing that had happened tonight. The worst thing that had happened tonight was that Ethan's two security staff, not Ethan himself, who had gone around the far side of the building to speak with someone on the radio, had made a joint decision, while she and Ethan were sitting quietly by the stone wall. They had apparently decided that the cordiality between their employer and the trespasser was getting out of hand. They had radioed the constable back before he had even reached the main road. They had met him at the gate. By the time Ethan had come back around the building, the constable was already there, and one of the security staff, a man named Holt with a very rigid jaw, had been explaining that he felt the matter should be formalized after all. Ethan had looked at Nadia, and she had seen, very briefly, something sharp and controlled move across his face. He had not argued in front of his staff. She had understood that. He was the kind of man who kept a certain amount of authority visible at all times, not out of ego but out of necessity, because he ran this land and the people on it alone, and undermining his own team publicly would cause problems that would outlast tonight. So the situation had shifted. She was sitting on a wooden chair in the security office with her kit on the floor, and her hands in zip ties, and the constable across the desk from her, writing in a notebook. "Ms. Jose," the constable said. His name was Rhys Davies, and she had gathered from the way he moved and spoke that this was not a man who enjoyed paperwork, but understood its necessity. "Walk me through your entry onto the property." She told him exactly what had happened. She held nothing back, because there was nothing to hold back. She had received a message, she had come. She had entered via the gate. The message was on her phone, which was currently in her jacket pocket, which she could not reach because of the zip ties, and she said so. Davies looked at the security staff member, Holt, and said calmly, "We'll need the phone." Holt retrieved it from her pocket, handling it the way people handled things they believed to be evidence of something. She had already unlocked it before Holt came into the office, which meant Davies could open it without needing her passcode, and he read the message from the unknown number twice. "You didn't attempt to contact the estate owner before entering?" Davies asked. "I didn't have contact information for the estate. I tried a general search before I left my facility, but I was focused on getting here quickly. The message suggested the animal was in significant distress." "And you have documentation of your rehabilitation license?" "In my kit. Front pocket, left side." Davies retrieved it himself. He read through the documentation with care, and set it on the desk in front of him. He picked up the phone again and read the message one more time. "This number," he said. "I know. It's a burner phone, or a prepaid SIM. I noticed that too." He looked up at her. "I've been thinking about who sent it," she said. "And why. Mr. Blackwood shared some relevant information with me earlier that might have a bearing on the source of the message." Davies' expression did not change much. "I'd like to hear that information. I'd suggest asking Mr. Blackwood directly. It's his information to share." This was the point at which the door opened, and Ethan walked in. He had clearly dealt with whatever he had needed to deal with outside, because he came in with his jaw set and his movement deliberate, and went directly to stand behind Davies on the far side of the desk. He was not aggressive about it. He simply stood there, which in a room this size made him a significant presence. "Constable Davies," he said. "I need to revise something I said earlier." Davies waited. "When you first arrived and I said I was not certain whether I wished to press this formally, I was operating without complete information. I now have more." Davies looked at him steadily. "I believe this woman was directed onto my property deliberately, by a third party with an interest in creating a formal trespass record. I believe the same party set the snare that injured my wolf as part of a pattern of targeted activity against this estate that has been ongoing for 6 months." He paused. "I am happy to provide full documentation of that pattern to you at any time. I have logs, camera records, and a timeline. However, I am not willing to serve as an instrument of that pattern by pressing a trespass charge against Ms. Jose, who came here tonight to help a suffering animal, and who, in my assessment, was deliberately used." The room was quiet. Davies said, "That's a significant claim." "I know. I'm not making it lightly. The formal caution stands regardless of your intent to press further charges." "Understood. And I'll need that documentation from you separately. You can have it tonight if you want it. I have the files on the system here." Davies wrote in his notebook for a moment. Then he looked at Nadia, then at Ethan, then back at Nadia. "Ms. Osei," he said, "I'm removing the restraints." He said this the way he said most things, which was as a plain statement of fact. He came around the desk and cut the zip ties with a small knife from his belt. She rubbed her wrists. They were fine. "You'll receive a formal trespass caution in the post within the week," he said. "That's standard, and I can't avoid it. But for the purposes of this evening, you're free to go." He paused. "I'd suggest staying on the property until you're ready to leave, rather than making any stops in the woodland on your way out." She understood he was being dry. "Of course," she said. He gathered his notebook and stood. He looked at Ethan. "I'll take those files now, if you have them." Ethan went to the computer on the desk, and for the next 10 minutes he went through the records with Davies. Camera timestamps, the pattern of incidents, the dates and locations, the map of where the disruptions had occurred in relation to each other. She watched from her chair and said nothing. She was good at watching and saying nothing. She had spent 11 years learning that the most important thing in a room was often not being said out loud. What she saw, watching Ethan Blackwood explain his records to a constable at close to midnight on a Tuesday in October, was a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and who had organized the weight of it very carefully so that it did not show. He was not a person who asked for help easily. She could see that in the way he presented the information, thorough, systematic, nothing left to chance, no gaps. He had built his own case because he had expected to have to present it alone. She thought about the wolf lying in the darkness outside and the 4 years of singular responsibility that had preceded tonight. She thought about the anonymous message on her phone and who might have sent it and what they had expected to happen when she arrived. She thought about the fact that whatever had been intended, what had actually happened, was something else entirely. Davies was finishing. He shook hands with Ethan and said he would be in touch. He said goodnight to Nadia with the particular politeness of a man who had made a judgment and decided she was not the source of the problem he had been called out to manage. Then he went out to his car, and the sound of the engine faded down the estate lane. Silence. Ethan stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, looking at the door the constable had gone through. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the restraints. That was Holt's decision, and it was not one I had sanctioned." "It's fine," she said. "I understand how it happened." He looked at her. "I do," she said. "You were out of the room, and your staff were doing what they thought was correct. I don't have any issue with your team." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. They were protecting your land. That's their job." He sat down on the edge of the desk. It was the first slightly informal thing she had seen him do, and she noticed it. He looked tired. Not dramatically tired, but the kind of tired that lives behind a person's eyes and only appears when they are very briefly not performing any particular function. "Your car is at the gate?" he said. "Yes, I parked just off the lane on the outside. I'll walk you out." "You don't need to." "I'll walk you out," he said again. Not insistently, just as though it was settled. She picked up her kit from the floor. She looked around the security office one last time. The stove, the map, the desk, the chair where she had sat for the past 40 minutes with her hands tied. An ordinary room that had held an extraordinary couple of hours. "The wolf," she said. "My rangers are with him. He should be checked in about 2 hours. The dressing needs to stay dry tonight, and if he tries to move around too much, someone should calm him. Talk to him low and steady. Don't try to hold him down." "I'll do it myself," Ethan said. She looked at him. She believed that. They walked out into the cold together. The floodlights over the northeast corner were off now. The estate was dark and still, and very large around them, the trees visible as shapes against a sky that was starting to clear toward the east. She could smell the woodland, the good deep smell of it, the wet earth, and the old bark, and the cold air moving through the branches. She walked beside him toward the gate. Their boots made quiet sounds on the lane. He opened the gate for her. She stepped through to the other side. Her car was where she had left it, parked in the small gravel verge off the lane. She put her kit in the boot and came around to the driver's door. She turned back because it would have been rude not to. Ethan was standing just inside the gate, his hand on the latch, watching her with an expression that she could not entirely read in the dark. "Thank you," she said. "For Ghost. And for the rest." "Thank you," he said. "For the same." She got into her car. She put the key in the ignition. The engine made a sound. Not the good sound of an engine starting. A different sound. A sound that a person who knows cars immediately recognizes as a sound that means something is wrong, followed by silence. She tried again. The same. She tried a third time, because sometimes a third time is different. It was not different. She sat for a moment in the cold car with the key still in the ignition, and the darkness around her, and a very strong feeling that the night was not finished with her yet. Then she got out. Ethan was still at the gate. He had not moved. He was looking at her car with the careful, neutral expression of a man who has heard what she heard and is waiting. "It won't start," she said. "No," he said. He did not say it with surprise. "Do you know anything about engines?" "Some. But it's close to 1 in the morning, and the nearest garage is 12 miles away, and doesn't open until 7. He paused. "There's a guest cottage on the estate. It's been used by visiting researchers. It's heated, and it has a bed." She looked at him. "It is a practical offer," he said. He said it as though he knew how it sounded, and was acknowledging that he knew, without making a performance of it. She looked at her car. She looked back at him. There was nothing threatening in him. There had not been, from the beginning, even when he had ordered her detained. He was a man who made decisions based on what he understood, and what he understood was changing as the night went on, and his decisions were changing with it. "All right," she said. He opened the gate again and let her back through. They walked back up the estate lane toward the cottage and the woodland, and the night settled around them, and somewhere in the northeast corner of the estate, in the dark beside the old stone wall, a gray wolf was breathing slowly and at rest. She did not know yet how long she would be here. She did not know what the morning would look like. She only knew that the car had not started, and the offer had been practical, and the night was very cold, and the stars were properly visible now, a full spread of them above the clearing ahead, bright and completely indifferent to anything that happened below them. She walked into the light coming from the cottage window, and the gate closed quietly behind her. The cottage was small and warm, and smelled of wood smoke and old stone, and something faintly like beeswax. There was a main room with 2 armchairs by a fireplace, a small kitchen beyond a low arch, and a short hallway that led, she assumed, to a bedroom. A lamp was on in the corner, giving off the kind of soft yellow light that makes any room feel more bearable. It had clearly been used recently. The fireplace had a fresh log in it, already catching, which meant someone on Ethan's staff had been told to prepare it, or he had called ahead from his radio while outside. She was not sure which. She did not ask. He showed her where the extra blankets were kept, and where the kettle was, and told her that the bathroom had hot water, and that breakfast things were in the kitchen if she needed them, before he was around in the morning. He said all of this efficiently, without ceremony, and then he said good night, and went out the door, and she heard his boots cross the gravel, and then the sound of them faded. She stood in the middle of the cottage for a moment in her muddy jacket with her kid on the floor beside her, and let the warmth of the room come in. Then she took off her jacket and her boots, and washed her hands at the kitchen sink, which was something she had been wanting to do for about 2 hours. She filled the kettle and set it on. She found a mug and a box of tea bags in the cupboard above, and while the kettle heated, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the darkness. She could not see the northeast corner from here. The estate was too large and too dense with trees, but she knew roughly where it was, and she knew that Ghost was there, resting, and that Ethan had said he would go out in 2 hours to check the dressing himself. She believed that too. She had believed most of what he had said, which was not something she said easily about people she had known for 3 hours. But there was a particular kind of reliability that came from watching someone act under pressure, rather than just listening to how they talked about themselves. What people did under pressure was what they were, as far as she was concerned. Tonight had been pressure, and she had watched. She made her tea and took it to the armchair nearest the fire. She had been in a lot of different places over the course of her career, in the field, in barns, in temporary rehabilitation setups ranging from the makeshift to the professional, but she had rarely ended up somewhere quite like this. The cottage was solid and comfortable and carefully maintained, the kind of place that had been looked after over time rather than thrown together. Through the small window, the woodland was pressed up close to the building on 2 sides, the trees visible as dark shapes against a sky that was now fully clear and full of stars. She thought about the snare. The snare bothered her more than anything else from tonight. Not what it had done to Ghost, though that was bad enough, but what it meant. The specific, targeted knowledge behind it. To put a trap in the exact place where an animal's habitual path ran was not the work of a general opportunist. It was the work of someone who had spent time watching, learning, mapping movement. It required patience, and it required access. And access to this estate, as far as she understood it, was tightly controlled. Peter Oakes, the head ranger who had left in April on bad terms. She turned the name over in her mind. She did not know him. She knew the type, a little, had encountered enough of them in her career. People who built expertise about a particular piece of land, and then found themselves bitter when the relationship with that land ended badly. Not all of them did something with that bitterness. Most didn't, but some did. She also thought about the message on her phone. Someone had known Ghost was in the snare, had known early enough, before Ethan's cameras picked it up at 8:47, which meant before dark. And whoever it was had not called Ethan, they had called her, or rather, sent a text, anonymous, unattributable, to a licensed wildlife rehabilitator with a documented reason to be on a property like this, and had done it in a way that would get her there as quickly as possible. She thought about two scenarios. In the first, the message came from someone sympathetic, a person who had seen what was happening on the estate, and wanted to help without being identified, someone who knew the land, and knew about Ghost, and knew who to call. In the second, the message came from someone who wanted her on the property, who wanted a record of her being there without permission, who had set up the situation to produce exactly the outcome it had nearly produced, a formal trespass, a licensed professional's reputation complicated, and Ethan Blackwood caught in a headline about mismanagement of a protected animal. The problem was that both scenarios used the same method and produced the same initial outcome. She could not tell them apart by looking at the message alone. She sipped her tea and looked at the fire. What she knew with certainty was this: the wolf had been hurt. That part was real. Whatever the intent behind the message, Ghost had been in that snare, and the wound had been real, and if she had not gone, he would have spent the night in it, and the infection risk was significant. Someone had set a trap, and whatever the purpose, an animal had suffered. That was the part she came back to, the part that had got her over the gate in the first place. She set her mug on the small table beside the armchair, and leaned back and closed her eyes. She was not going to sleep. She was too alert for sleep, her mind still running through the events of the past 3 hours. But she let her body rest, which was a different thing. She let the warmth of the fire do its work, and she let the sounds of the woodland settle into the background, the creak of branches, the distant call of something in the trees, the small and constant life of a place that went on being alive regardless of what the humans on its edges were doing. She thought about Ethan Blackwood standing at the gate in the dark. She thought about the way he had said it was settled, simply and without elaboration, when she had said he did not need to walk her out. The way that had not been unkind or controlling, just certain. The way he had stood in the light of the security office, looking at his files with the same directness he gave to everything, not performing it, just doing it. She had met a lot of landowners over the years. Most of them fell into recognizable types. The ones who treated their land as an asset and talked about it in financial terms. The ones who were passionate but chaotic, all energy and no system. The ones who were suspicious of anyone with letters after their name and a license in their kit, who saw expertise as a challenge to their authority rather than a resource. Ethan did not fit any of these. He was someone who had made a considered choice about what he wanted to build, and was building it with careful, solitary intensity, and who had, in the middle of a crisis, also managed to be fair to a stranger, who had complicated his night considerably. She was not idealizing him. She was being honest. Those were just the facts as she had observed them. The fire crackled. A log shifted and settled. She heard footsteps outside, soft ones, crossing the gravel, and then they stopped. She opened her eyes. There was a knock at the door. Quiet. She crossed the room and opened it. Ethan was standing on the step with his jacket still on, and the dark woodland behind him. He looked as though he had come from the northeast corner of the estate, which she suspected he had, because there was fresh mud on his boots, and his breath was showing in the cold air. "Sorry to disturb you," he said. "You're not disturbing me. How is he?" "Calm. He's sleeping now. I checked the dressing. It looked good. Any sign he'd tried to move around?" He had shifted position, but only slightly. He seemed comfortable. She nodded. That's what you want, as long as he's not putting weight on it. He wasn't. A silence. He didn't leave, and he didn't come in, and she wondered what he had come to say that he had not already said. I also wanted to tell you, he said, that I called a colleague of mine. He runs a small mechanical workshop in the valley. He'll come in the morning and look at your car. He's done work here before, and I trust him. She looked at him. He won't charge you, Ethan said, preempting the obvious question. I'll handle that. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary. I'd like to do it. Another silence. She thought about saying something about the fact that this was too much, that she did not expect it, that the cottage itself was already more than she had any claim to. She thought about the various appropriate things to say in this situation. Then she decided not to say any of them. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded. He looked past her at the cottage for a moment, the fire visible through the door, the lamp in the corner. Something in his expression was quieter than it had been before, as though some kind of sustained effort had been briefly suspended. Get some rest, he said. You too. He turned and walked back across the gravel toward the main house. She watched him go until the darkness took him. She went back inside, and closed the door, and stood for a moment in the warmth. Then she went to the kitchen, and made another cup of tea, and sat back down by the fire, and the night moved around her, slow and quiet, and she let it. Outside, somewhere in the northeast corner of the estate, a gray wolf slept in the cold October dark, and the stars turned overhead, and the woodland breathed in and out around everything, and the world was what it always was at this particular hour. Very large, and very old, and not especially concerned with the small decisions that people made in its midst. But it held them anyway. It always did. She drank her tea, and watched the fire, and waited for morning. The mechanic arrived at 7:15. His name was Alan, and he had the particular cheerfulness of a person who is most comfortable when something is broken and needs fixing. He spent 12 minutes under the bonnet of Nadia's car, emerged with oil on his hand, and told her it was the starter motor. She had known men who would have said this with a flourish, as though identifying the problem was itself an accomplishment. Alan said it the way you might tell someone the time. It was the starter motor. He had a replacement in the workshop. He could have it done by mid-morning. She thanked him. He drove back down the lane, and she stood on the gravel in the early morning light with her jacket on, and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The estate was a different world in daylight. She had arrived in the dark, and spent the night enclosed by the sense of it, without seeing it clearly, the way you sometimes understand a room from its sounds before you see it. Now, standing outside the cottage in the low, clean light of an October morning, she saw Blackwood Ridge for what it actually was. It was extraordinary. The woodland stretched in every direction, mature and dense, the trees old enough to have developed the character that comes with decades of growth, the way branches begin to tell their own specific story, the way bark textures differently in different conditions, the way the light through old growth is not like light through young trees. To the north, the ground rose toward a ridgeline that was still in shadow. To the east, through a gap in the trees, she could see the rough grassland that she guessed had once been farmed, and was slowly returning to something older. Birds were everywhere. She could hear at least 6 species without trying. The clean whistle of a robin, a pair of jays moving loudly in the oaks to the left, something higher and thinner, that she thought might be a tree creeper. There was a quality to the sound that only happened in land that had been left alone long enough, not the managed quiet of a park or garden, but the layered, complex sound of a place with real biodiversity. She stood and listened to it for a while. Then she heard footsteps, and turned to see Ethan coming around the side of the main house with 2 mugs. He handed one to her. "Alan's been?" he said. "Starter motor. He says mid-morning." "Good. He's reliable." She wrapped both hands around the mug. The tea was strong and dark, and exactly right for the temperature and the hour. They stood in the early quiet, looking at the estate. "Have you owned this land long?" she asked. "I grew up here. My grandfather farmed it until the 90s, and then the farm was sold in parts when he died, and this section passed through 2 other owners, before I was able to buy it back 10 years ago." "You bought it back." "It took time to be in a position to do it. But yes." She looked at the woodland. She could see what 10 years of careful work had produced. "The rewilding started when you bought it?" "Immediately. The farmland to the east was under arable use. I took it out of production in year 1. The woodland was already here. Its old growth in sections, some of it older than the estate records. The previous owners had done very little with it except leave it alone, which it turned out was exactly the right thing to do. And the wolf? Ghost was not planned, he said. He was a consequence of someone else's cruelty, and then a decision I made in response to it. She thought about the pup he had described, 8 weeks old, fitting in 2 hands, going still and invisible in the dark of the barn. Do you think about expanding the project? She said. Beyond the current 400 acres? Constantly. There is farmland to the north that is currently in transition. The farmer is in his 70s and has no heir, and has made it clear he would prefer the land go to a conservation buyer. I'm in discussion. She looked at him. He said it without boasting, simply as a fact in progress. If you expanded north, she said, and the habitat was connected, the grassland corridor through to the ridge, you would have something significant. I know. He paused. It's a 15-year vision, possibly 20. These things don't move quickly. No, she thought about the Dunmore Wildlife Center, about the barn she had converted, the animals she had treated, the slow accumulation of a thing that mattered. They don't. He looked at her sideways. You've been building something too. For 8 years. Is the facility self-sufficient? Mostly. Grant-dependent, for about 1/3 of the operating budget. The rest comes from fees for the work I do on a consultancy basis. Surveys, assessments, that kind of thing. It's tight, most years, but it works. You have 2 part-time staff. She remembered that she had told him this last night. Yes. Marcus runs the daily care schedule. He's been with me for 5 years. Clara handles the records and the license paperwork. Without her, the whole operation would collapse inside a week. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it resolved into something more guarded. I had a head ranger for 6 years, who was the equivalent, he said. When Oakes left, I realized how much I had delegated to him. Not just the practical work, but the knowledge of the land. He knew where everything happened, which routes the deer used, where the badger sets were, which sections of the boundary were vulnerable. And now all of that knowledge is with someone who may be working against you. Yes. She thought about that. She thought about walking through this woodland in the dark, and the quality of the silence, and what it would feel like to have someone with intimate knowledge of it, using that knowledge as a weapon. The footage from the cameras, she said. You said Ghost's movements were what allowed the snare to be placed accurately. Would those movement patterns be recorded anywhere Oakes could have taken with him when he left? Ethan was quiet for a moment. The old monitoring logs, he said slowly. Before I upgraded the system in June, he would have had access to those. I didn't think to revoke it when he left, because the old system was being decommissioned. She waited. I'll check, he said. She nodded. They drank their tea. The morning light was strengthening, moving in long angles through the trees to the east, picking out the surfaces of bark and leaf and stone wall, in a way that made everything look more itself. I need to go and check Ghost, she said. I was going the same way. They walked through the estate together in the morning light. She had walked this path twice now in the dark, and did not entirely recognize it by day. The angle of the land was different than she had imagined, and there were details the flashlight had not shown her. A section of stone wall covered in thick moss, a very old oak on the left, with a hollow at its base, large enough for a person to sit in. She pointed at it. Lightning, Ethan said. Decades ago, the tree grew around it. How old is the tree? 300 years, roughly, give or take. She looked at it as they passed. 300 years. The tree had been here when the estate was first laid out, when the stone walls were first built, when everything that now looked ancient was being made new. It had been here through everything that had happened on this land, all the farming and the selling and the loss and the return, and it had simply continued being a tree. She found that steadying. She always did, in the presence of something that old. Ghost was in the northeast corner where they had left him, but he had moved during the night. He was no longer lying against the stone wall. He was sitting upright, about 10 feet from where the snare had been, watching the approach through the trees with his amber eyes. The cut wire was still on the ground where she had left it. She would retrieve it before she left. It was a loose end that needed dealing with. Ghost saw them coming. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Nadia. Then he stood up. She went very still, watching him. He put weight on the injured leg. She watched the way he distributed it. Careful, testing. Not full weight, but trying. He was measuring the damage, the way animals do. He walked 3 steps. Then he stopped and looked at her. The dressing was intact. The leg was taking weight, partially. It was too early to know yet whether there would be any lasting issue, but she had seen the wound, and she did not think there would be. The injury had been treated promptly. He was strong and young and otherwise healthy. He walked another 3 steps toward her. Then he stopped again. Ethan beside her said nothing. He was completely still. She could feel the attention in him, the focused quiet of someone watching something that matters. Ghost walked the remaining distance between them and stopped about 2 feet in front of her. He was very large. Up close, in full morning light, with his silver-gray coat and his amber eyes and the full breadth of his shoulders, he was an animal who filled his space entirely. There was nothing diminished about him. He looked at her face for a long moment. She held very still and let him. Then he turned and walked 3 steps away and sat down and looked out at the woodland, as though the assessment had been made and filed and was now complete. She breathed out. Ethan, beside her, breathed out too. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "He's going to be fine," she said, eventually. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Yes," Ethan said. He sounded like a man who had been holding a considerable amount of worry and had just been relieved of it. She crouched down and retrieved the cut snare wire from the grass and folded it and put it in her kit pocket. Evidence, potentially. She would hand it to Davies if he needed it. When she straightened up, Ethan was looking at the place where the snare had been fixed to the ground, the hole where the stake had gone in, the disturbed earth around it. "I'm going to have the cameras checked today," he said, "and the perimeter, and I'm going to call Davies." "Good. And I'm going to look at the old monitoring logs access records." "Also good." He looked at her. "You give very measured responses." "I've been told." "Is it deliberate?" "Mostly. I've learned that the fewer words I use in a professional situation, the more people actually hear them." He considered this with what she was beginning to recognize as his characteristic way of taking things seriously before responding. "That is probably true." She looked at Ghost, who was sitting with his back to them now, watching the woodland with the satisfied expression of an animal who is where he wants to be and is not interested in the human conversation behind him. She thought about the car and the 12 miles and Alan at the workshop and the 15 things waiting for her at the Dunmore Wildlife Center and the fact that she had been on someone else's land for the better part of 10 hours. She thought about the fact that she did not entirely want to leave. She filed that observation in the same drawer where she kept other things that required thinking about at a later and more appropriate time, which was a drawer that had quite a bit in it. "I should go and see how Alan is getting on," she said. "I'll walk back with you." They walked back through the estate in the morning light, the trees bright and detailed around them, and when they reached the cottage, she gathered her kit and her jacket, and they walked the rest of the way to the gate. Alan was pulling back in off the lane as they arrived. He had the starter motor in a case on the back seat. He got out with his characteristic lack of drama, and said he would have it done in about 40 minutes, and Nadia said thank you, and he lifted the bonnet without further ceremony. This was a different goodbye than the one last night. Last night had been charged with unresolved things. The trespass, the constable, the wolf not yet settled. This morning, those things had resolved themselves, or begun to. There was space, now, that had not been there before. "I meant what I said about the monitoring logs," she said. "If you find anything, Davies will need it documented properly. Don't move anything or alter anything on the system before he's seen it." "I know. And Ghost's dressing needs to be changed in 48 hours. I'll write up the wound specification and the aftercare instructions and send them to you today. I'd appreciate that." She paused. She thought about the estate in the morning light and the 300-year oak and the way the birds sounded when a place had been left alone long enough to become itself. "If you need a second assessment at any point," she said, "about the wildlife program, the direction, the viability, what species might work in the expanded corridor if the northern land comes through, I can do that. Formally, I mean, on a proper consultation basis." He looked at her. "It's relevant work for the center," she said, "and I have experience with rewilding corridor planning. It wouldn't be a favor." I didn't think it would be, he said. A beat. I'll contact you, he said. About the consultation, this week, if that works. That works. She picked up her kit. Under the bonnet of the car, Alan was making the particular sounds of a person who knows exactly what they are doing, and is doing it efficiently. The morning light was full and clear now, and the estate was behind Ethan like a painting, the old trees and the stone walls, and the sky above the ridge. Ghost was somewhere in there, sitting in his woodland, watching with amber eyes, breathing slowly, healed. She said goodbye. Ethan Blackwood said goodbye. She got in her car when Alan was done, and the engine turned over on the first try, and she drove down the lane toward the main road, and when she looked in the mirror before the lane bent away into the trees, he was still standing at the gate. She looked ahead. The road was clear, and the morning was sharp and cold and beautiful, and she had a full day of work ahead of her, and a Wolf's aftercare instructions to write up, and a consultation offer on the table, from a man who was building something serious in an old piece of land that had been given back to itself. She drove. And she thought about none of it, and all of it at once, the way you do when something has happened that you have not yet found the right words for, but that you know, with a certainty that does not need words, has changed something in you. She kept driving. The morning held. The aftercare instructions she sent were 4 pages long. She had drafted them that afternoon at her desk at the Dunmore Wildlife Center, with Marcus running the daily feeding rounds in the yard outside her window, and the sounds of the facility carrying on around her in the ordinary way of things. She wrote clearly and methodically, covering the wound, the dressing, the signs to watch for, the timeline for recovery, the behavioral indicators that would tell him whether Ghost was managing well or whether something needed attention. She almost stopped at 2 pages. Then she thought about the distance between the estate and the nearest veterinary practice with any real experience of large predators, and she added 2 more. She sent it at 5:30 that evening. His reply came at 7:15. It said, "Thank you. This is thorough. I'll follow it carefully. The cameras found something. I'll be calling Davies in the morning." She read it twice. She wrote back, "Good. Let me know what he says." He did not reply again that evening. She did not expect him to. Over the next 3 days she thought about Blackwood Ridge more than was strictly professional, and she acknowledged this to herself without judgment, and got on with her work. The work was what it always was, multiple animals at different stages of treatment and recovery, the constant documentation required by the licenses, the calls and emails and consultations that made up the visible fabric of running a small rehabilitation facility. A juvenile heron had come in on Tuesday with a wing fracture, found in a drainage ditch by a woman who had driven 20 miles to deliver it because she had not known what else to do. By Thursday, it was eating fish from the tongs and giving the staff filthy looks, which was a very good sign. Ghost was in her mind underneath all of it, not obtrusively, just present, the way a thing is present when you have put a significant amount of care into it, and you are waiting to know whether the care took. She called Marcus into the office on Thursday morning. He was 26, with the kind of patient, specific attention to animal behavior that could not be taught. Either you had the eye, or you did not, and Marcus had had it since the first day she took him on. He managed the daily operations of the center with a consistency that she had come to rely on, in a way that she tried not to take for granted. "I may have a consultancy project coming in," she said. "Rewilding corridor assessment, potentially. It would require some site visits, probably spread over a few weeks. I'd need you to hold the fort here during those." He looked at her with the expression he had when he was thinking through logistics. "During the heron's recovery window?" he said. "Possibly overlapping. I'd schedule around the critical periods. Clara could cover the afternoon feeds on those days." "I thought so too." He nodded. "Who's the project with?" "Blackwood Ridge Estate, northeast of here." "A beat." "The rewilding project?" She looked at him. "You know it?" "Of it. Peter Oakes used to do the ranger work there. He came to a talk we gave at the Wildlife Trust in March." He paused. He had some strong opinions. She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of opinions?" "About the management approach." He felt the owner, Blackwood, right, was too singular about it, too resistant to outside input. Oakes thought the project could be significantly more effective with a different management structure. She held this. "Did he say anything specific about why he left?" Marcus thought. He said something about a conflict over the wolf. He thought Ghost should have been assessed for release to a facility rather than kept on the estate. He thought keeping him there was more about the owner's attachment than the animal's welfare. She kept her expression neutral. And what did the talk audience think of that? I think most people thought he was probably right about the management model, but a little bitter about the personal side. She thanked him, and he went back out to the yard. She sat at her desk and thought about Peter Oakes and his views on Ghost's welfare and his attendance at a public wildlife trust talk in March, and what any of that added to the picture. She thought about what it meant to frame a genuine conservation attachment as mere personal attachment. The two could overlap, obviously. In her experience, they almost always did. But conflating them entirely, using one to dismiss the other, was a particular kind of argument that she recognized, and it was usually made by someone who wanted to disqualify something without engaging with it. She thought about Ethan sitting on the cold ground at 1 a.m, with a wolf's head not quite in his lap, talking in a low voice about 4 years of solitary responsibility. She thought, Peter Oakes did not know what he was looking at. She filed that thought in the drawer. On Friday morning, Ethan called rather than emailed. She was in the yard when her phone rang, and she saw his name and stepped back inside. The cameras caught footage of a vehicle accessing the estate from the southeast corner 2 weeks ago, he said, without preamble. He knew she would know what he meant. The date lines up with when the snare could have been placed. The vehicle is a dark blue pickup, registered to a holding company with a P.O. box in Bristol. I've given everything to Davies. That's progress. Davies thinks so. He's pursuing the company records. A pause. He also confirmed that the snare wire matches a batch used commercially for a type of trapping that has been illegal in this country since 2019. It's a specific manufacturer. That narrows things considerably. She leaned against the wall of the corridor, looking at the yard through the glass door. Marcus was doing the morning round. The heron was visible in its temporary enclosure, standing in the shallow water of its recovery pool, with the dignity of an animal who has decided to be completely unbothered by its situation. And Ghost? She said. I changed the dressing last night. It looked good. He let me do it without any difficulty.
He let you?
He sat down and watched me very carefully the entire time, but he didn't move away. That's him telling you he approves of your technique, she said. There was a short pause. Then, I suppose that's encouraging. It is. She smiled slightly, where he couldn't see it. He's healing well then. He is. Your instructions were clear. I followed them exactly. She believed that too. The consultation offer, he said, after a moment. I've been thinking about it. So have I. I'd like to take you up on it. The northern land question is moving more quickly than I expected. The farmer has indicated he'd like to finalize something before the new year, which gives me a narrow window to assess whether the corridor plan is viable. I'd need a proper ecological survey of both properties and an assessment of what a connected landscape would actually support. She was already thinking about methodology. That's a 6 to 8 week project minimum, done properly. Can you take it on with your current load? I'll need to restructure some things, but yes, she paused. I'll need access to the full estate records. Camera data, species logs, the monitoring history going back to when you started the project. Of course. And I'll need to meet with Davies at some point, not about the snare specifically, but about the legal framework for what the expanded estate would require in terms of wildlife licensing. I can arrange that. She looked out at the yard. The heron had caught something in the water, a small piece of food Marcus had left there, and was eating it with the focused absorption of an animal that has decided to recover. The first site visit, she said. When works for you? Next week, he said. Wednesday. If that suits. Wednesday works. I'll send the gate code. You won't need to climb the fence this time. It was the closest thing to a joke she had heard him make. She recognized it as such by the very slight shift in the quality of the silence after he said it. That's probably for the best, she said. They arranged the details and said goodbye, and she stood in the corridor for a moment, with her phone in her hand, looking at the yard, and the heron, and the ordinary morning proceeding around her. Then she went back to work. She wrote up the consultation agreement that afternoon. She was thorough about the terms, scope of work, timeline, deliverables, fee structure. She was never casual about professional terms, not because she didn't trust the people she worked with, but because clarity at the beginning saved everyone a great deal of difficulty at the end. She had learned this the hard way, early in her career, and had not forgotten it. She sent it to him at 6 that evening. His reply came at 6:40. It said, "The terms are fair. I'll sign and return tomorrow. There's one addition I'd like to make to the scope. Assessment of habitat suitability for a second wolf. Long term. No timeline required. Just want it included." She read that 3 times. Then she wrote back, "I'll add it." She put her phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. A second wolf, a long-term vision. A man who had spent 4 years building something on his own, and was now, carefully and methodically, and in the particular way he did everything, beginning to plan for more. She thought about the corridor through the northern grassland. She thought about what a connected landscape of that size would support, given time. She thought about Ghost, sitting in his woodland with his amber eyes, having already made his own assessment of the situation. She picked up her pen and started making notes. There was a great deal to plan. There was the survey methodology and the species mapping, and the legal framework, and the timeline, and all the practical infrastructure of a serious conservation project. There were months of work ahead, and she was good at that kind of work, and she was looking forward to it, in the straightforward professional way of a person whose work and passion have never fully separated. There was also something else, smaller and quieter, that she did not put into the notes. Something in the drawer. Something that could wait. She kept writing. Outside, the evening came in quietly, and the animals in the center made their small nighttime sounds, and the work continued the way it always did, steady and necessary, and worth doing. And somewhere across the valley in the October dark, a wolf was walking the boundary of his woodland in the frost, unhurried, whole. In the weeks that followed, the work had its own rhythm, and Nadia moved inside it. She had always been someone who worked best when moving, not restlessly, but purposefully, with the particular energy that comes from having a clear objective and sufficient information to pursue it. The Blackwood Ridge consultation gave her both, and she found herself approaching it with the kind of focused intensity she brought to things she genuinely cared about. The first Wednesday site visit set the pattern. She arrived at 8 in the morning with her survey kit, and spent the day walking the estate with Ethan, covering the woodland and the eastern grassland, and the north boundary where the land she hoped to assess bordered. He walked as he talked, efficiently, without unnecessary stops, covering distance the way someone does who has done it many times. She kept pace, and asked questions, and wrote things down. He answered everything directly and without omission. She appreciated that. She had worked with landowners who managed information, like a resource to be doled out strategically, revealing things in the order they thought benefited them. Ethan simply told her what she needed to know, when she needed to know it. It made the work go faster. They covered ground she had not seen by night. There was a valley at the western edge of the estate that opened into a narrow gill with a stream running through it, and the banks of the stream were thick with wild garlic that would bloom in spring, and a dense understory of wood sorrel and fern. She stopped and spent 20 minutes there, crouching over the bank, looking at invertebrate signs, taking soil samples. He stood and waited without suggesting she hurry. She looked up at one point and found him watching the stream rather than her, standing very still, in the way she had noticed he did in wild places, not impatient, not distracted, simply present in his own quiet way. She thought about what Marcus had said, that Peter Oakes had believed the project would be better with a different management structure, more people, more input, less single-minded focus. Standing in that gill, she thought Oakes had been wrong, not about the value of collaboration, she believed in that entirely, but about what the project needed from Ethan specifically. Some things could only be built by one person who wanted it badly enough to do it alone for a long time. You could not build a place like this by committee. You could add expertise and resource later, once the foundation was laid. But the foundation had to be laid by someone who could not afford to stop. She kept these thoughts to herself. They ate lunch, sitting on a section of stone wall at the north edge of the estate, with the rough grassland of the potential new land spread out below them. She had bought sandwiches from a bakery on the way in. He had, she discovered, brought a flask of coffee, which was considerably better than the sandwich. The grassland, she said, between one sandwich and the next. How long has it been under arable use? The south portion was still cropped as recently as 5 years ago. The north section, the part closest to the ridge, was taken out earlier, maybe 8 years. So the north section will have had more time for baseline recovery. I'd expect more invertebrate diversity there. Possibly small mammal recovery, which affects what raptors use it. She looked at the land. Have you had barn owls? Irregularly. I put up 3 boxes in the western section. One is used in good years. If the northland comes in, and you can extend the short grass habitat along the ridge, the owl territory becomes viable for a permanent pair. He looked at the land, too. A second wolf in that habitat, she said, thinking aloud rather than forming a conclusion, would require the connected corridor to be substantially larger than what you currently have. Ghost's range on the estate is manageable, because he chooses not to test the boundaries. A second animal changes the social dynamic. They may both range further, and the boundaries become more significant. I've been thinking about that. The legal framework is also complex. Your current permission is specific to Ghost. A second animal would require a separate application, different documentation, and the welfare assessment would be more involved because you'd be introducing a social dynamic that doesn't currently exist. I know. That's partly why I wanted the habitat assessment first. I need to know whether what we're building could support it before I take the welfare question anywhere near an official body. She nodded. That was the right order of operations. They sat in the quiet for a moment. Below them, a kestrel was hovering over the rough grassland, its whole body tilted into the wind with the mechanical precision of a hunting bird. Do you know the Carmel Rewilding Project? She said. In Wales? Yes. They introduced a pair 2 years after establishing the corridor. The welfare assessment took nearly a year, but the outcome has been positive. If you want, I can put you in contact with the lead researcher. Her name is Frances Dunn. She went through the process and would know what the current regulatory environment looks like. I'd appreciate that. She took out her notebook and wrote Frances Dunn's name at the top of a page and circled it. You know a lot of people, he said. I've been in the field a long time. That's not what I mean. You know the right people. The specific people. She looked at him. Oakes knew a lot of people too, he said carefully. But they were network people. People who knew people. You name someone, and then you tell me what they did that's specific, and what they found that matters. I read everything, she said, and I remember it. Yes, I've noticed. She looked at the kestrel, which had dropped, risen again, and was now hovering slightly to the left of where it had been. How long did Oakes work here before things went wrong? About 3 years of good work, and then a change. What kind of change? He stopped bringing me information, and started offering interpretations of information instead, conclusions without the evidence behind them. I asked for the underlying data on several occasions, and found reasons to be delayed. He paused. In retrospect, I think he was managing what I knew in a way that would eventually position him as the expert, and me, as the owner, who needed an expert to understand his own land. She thought about that. And the conflict about Ghost? She said. He believed Ghost should be transferred to a managed facility, a wildlife park or specialist center. He said it was in the wolf's best interests. His voice remained completely level as he said this. He presented it as a welfare concern. I believe it was an attempt to remove the most significant element of the project and replace it with something that needed his specific expertise to manage. He wanted to make himself indispensable. Yes. She looked at her notebook. She thought about the right thing to say, and decided, as she often did, that less was more. Ghost is in better health than any wolf I've assessed in a managed facility setting, she said simply. He looked at her. That's not sentiment, she said. That's observation. He is a physically healthy, behaviorally intact adult wolf, living in a suitable environment, with adequate range and appropriate stimulation. His response to stress last week, the snare situation, was exactly what you would want. He did not panic. He did not injure himself further by fighting the restraint beyond the initial response. He regulated. That's a psychologically stable animal. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Oakes wouldn't have had access to that assessment, she said. He formed his view from the outside. He may have been sincere about the welfare concern, but he was wrong. He was still quiet. I'm telling you this, she said, not to be kind. I'm telling you because it's relevant to any future welfare application for a second animal. The management approach here is clearly working, and I'll be able to say that with documentation. Thank you, he said. It was a very simple thank you. The kind a person gives when they have been carrying something for a while, and someone has just, briefly, lifted the edge of it. She looked back at the Kestrel. They finished the lunch in the good silence of two people who have covered ground together, and have more ground to cover, and are comfortable with the distance between them. In the afternoon she did the camera location survey, walking the estate boundary with a clipboard, and the existing camera map, checking sight lines and coverage gaps. He walked with her for part of it, and then went off to deal with something on the radio, and she continued alone for an hour and a half, which she did not mind. She was used to working alone. She was efficient at it. But she noticed, when he came back, that the afternoon had felt longer. She drove home as the light was failing. The lane off the estate bent through the trees, and then out onto the main road, and she accelerated into the clear, and the sky above the valley was a deep, clear blue, going toward navy at the edges. She thought about the Kestrel on its wind. She thought about the 300-year oak with the hollow at its base. She thought about what a connected landscape looked like from the air, from the inside, from the point of view of every animal that moved through it, according to its own logic. She thought about Ethan walking beside her through the gill, standing very still at the stream, watching the water go over the stones. She thought about the drawer. She drove home and fed her cat and ate her supper standing up at the kitchen counter, the way she often did when she was thinking. And when she sat down at her desk to write up the day's notes, she wrote for an hour without stopping, filling in details and observations, and flagging questions to follow up. At the bottom of the day's notes she wrote, very small, and then crossed out, and then left. Coming back next Wednesday. Not because it needed to be noted. She knew when the next visit was. She left it there anyway. Closed the notebook. And went to bed with the particular feeling of a person who is in the middle of something that is going well in more ways than one, and who knows it, and who is being careful and patient and sensible about all of it, and who is also, quietly and without any fuss, very glad. Peter Oakes was arrested on a Thursday morning in November. Nadia heard about it from Davies, who called her at 9:30 on his way to the station to ask whether she still had the snare wire, and if so, whether she could confirm the chain of custody from the night she had retrieved it. She confirmed it. She had bagged it the morning after, labeled it correctly, and stored it in the evidence box she kept for exactly these situations. She told him she would have it to him by end of day. She drove to the station in the afternoon with the evidence bag, and sat across from Davies in a small interview room, while he logged it, and she signed the form, and they talked briefly about what it meant. What it meant was this. The vehicle that the estate cameras had caught 2 weeks before the snare incident had been traced through the holding company to a man with a previous address in the same county, and that man had a documented relationship with Oakes that went back 4 years. The snare wire had come from a batch sold by a supplier that Oakes had used commercially during his ranger work, and a phone registered in the name of the holding company had been found to be the source of the message sent to Nadia the night of the incident. The anonymous message. The one that had sent her over the gate. She absorbed all of this carefully. He used you, Davies said, not unkindly. As a statement of fact. I know. The intention was to get a licensed professional onto the estate without permission, create a trespass record, and use that record in a press complaint about the management of a protected animal. It would have made things complicated for Mr. Blackwood, at a point when he's in the middle of a land acquisition. I understand. For what it's worth, Davies said, I don't think you did anything wrong. You responded to what appeared to be a genuine welfare emergency with appropriate haste. You had no way of knowing the source was compromised. No, she said, but I still crossed a gate without permission. You did. He looked at her steadily. The caution stands. That's correct procedure, and I won't apologize for it. I wouldn't expect you to. He nodded, and she thought she saw something like respect in his expression. Not warm, exactly. Just the particular regard that a careful professional gives another careful professional when they each do their job correctly. She thanked him and left. She sat in her car outside the station for a moment. She thought about the walk through the dark with the flashlight and the mud and the cold, and the snare, and Ghost lying in the grass, and the floodlights coming on. She thought about whether, knowing now what had been arranged, she would have made a different decision. She would not. She would have gone over the gate again. The wolf had been injured. The welfare emergency had been real, whatever the intent behind the message. She would make the same choice 10 times in 10 different situations, and she was not going to apologize for it. But she also knew that it had been closer than she had realized. A different landowner would have pressed the trespass. A different constable would have moved faster. She had walked into a situation that had been designed to damage something, and she had been lucky, and she was honest enough with herself to sit with that. Then she started the car and drove. She called Ethan from the estate lane, where the signal was better. He picked up on the second ring. "Davies called you?" she said. "An hour ago. I wanted to make sure you'd heard." "I had." A pause. "Thank you for taking care of the evidence. Davies said you handled the chain of custody correctly." "Standard procedure." "Nothing about the way you handle things is standard," he said, and it was said so quietly and so plainly that it took her a moment to fully receive it. She drove. The road curved past a farm with bare winter fields on both sides, the soil dark and turned. "How do you feel about it?" she said. "The arrest." He was quiet for a moment, relieved mostly, and angry, still. The kind of anger that doesn't have anywhere to go now. "Does it need to go somewhere?" "I don't know. I've spent 6 months managing the fallout of what he was doing. The cameras and the patrols and the investigation. The sense of the estate being under threat from the inside. I've been running the land and running a defense operation at the same time. And now you don't need to do both. And now I don't need to do both." She heard the land in his voice when he said that, the release of something he had been carrying for a long time. "Ghost had a good morning," he said, shifting. "He covered most of the eastern section. I tracked him on the new camera grid. He stopped near the gill for about 20 minutes. "Looking for fish," she said. "Almost certainly." A pause. "He doesn't catch them, but he watches them." She smiled. "Wednesday is the 3rd survey visit," she said. "Yes. I'll have the first section of the ecological report done by then. I can walk you through the findings. I'll have coffee ready." She drove home through the November afternoon, the light already going at 4, the sky colorless and wide above the valley. She thought about the snare wire in its evidence bag, and Peter Oakes, and the particular kind of damage that comes from a trusted person deciding to use their trust as a weapon. She had seen that before, in different forms, in different situations. It was always the same at its core. Someone who had been given access, choosing to use that access destructively, rather than constructively. It was a choice, every time. And the damage it did was not just material, but relational, because the aftermath of it made every future trust harder to give. She knew Ethan understood this. She did not need to say it. What she thought about, instead, was the new camera grid he had mentioned. She had helped him plan it. They had spent the better part of a Wednesday afternoon mapping it together, using the species survey data she had been building, and the terrain knowledge he had spent 10 years accumulating. It had been the kind of work that was satisfying in a very specific way. 2 people with complementary skills, and a shared objective, making something better than either of them would have made alone. She had thought about that afternoon several times since. She pulled into the lane to the Dunmore Wildlife Center, and parked and sat for a moment before going in. The heron had been released 2 days ago. She had driven it to the reservoir at the edge of the county, and stood at the bank and watched it go, standing for a moment in the shallows, looking around with the suspicious intelligence of a bird that has decided everything is sufficiently acceptable, and then lifting and going, long wings pulling it low across the water, and then up, until it was a shape against the November sky, and then nothing. She had stood at the bank for a few minutes after. She always did, when they went. She had never managed to become entirely professional about it. Something left, each time, that she could not fully account for in the records, and she stood in the wake of it, and let herself feel it, and then went back to the car. This was the work. The work was also this. She got out of the car and went inside. Marcus had left a note on the kitchen table. New referral called. Red kite with a suspected fracture. Coming in Friday. She read it and wrote back under it. Confirm the intake. Set up bay 4. She put the kettle on and stood at the window and looked at the yard in the fading light. The Dunmore Wildlife Center had been an empty barn 8 years ago, and now it was this. A working, licensed, functional facility, treating multiple animals at any given time, staffed by people who were good at their work, maintaining records that met the highest standards, contributing to the conservation framework of the region, in a way that was small, but not insignificant. She had built this the same way Ethan had built Blackwood Ridge, alone, over time, with accumulated stubbornness and specific expertise, and the inability to do the work in a lesser way, even when a lesser way would have been easier. She had never particularly thought about the parallel before. She thought about it now. She poured her tea, and went to her desk, and opened her laptop, and began to write up the day's notes. At the bottom she added, Wednesday. 3rd survey visit. 1st section of ecological report. And then, because she was honest with herself even when she was cautious with everyone else. The work is going well. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet for a moment. The animals in the center made their small sounds around her, and the night came in over the yard, and outside the first proper frost of the season was forming on the fields, and everything was continuing in the ordinary and necessary way of things. She thought about Peter Oakes, who had spent 3 years building access to something that mattered, and then chose what he chose. She thought about how different that was from the other kind of choice, the long, patient, costly choice, to build rather than to damage. She thought about an estate 400 acres deep in the valley, and the man who had given his working life to returning it to itself, and a wolf with amber eyes walking the gill at 10 in the morning, watching fish he was not going to catch. She got up and went to make supper, and the drawer stayed closed a little longer, because some things were worth taking time with, and she had always known how to be patient. It was the wolf who made the decision, in the end. Nadia had been at Blackwood Ridge on the Wednesday of the 4th week of the consultation when it happened. She was at the desk in the main house. Ethan had given her use of it during the site visits, which was a practical gesture she had accepted practically, working through the habitat connectivity data, when she heard boots on the stone outside, and Ethan came in from the yard. He was slightly out of breath, which was unusual for him. "You need to come and see this," he said. She closed the laptop and followed him out. He led her across the yard and through the gate, into the western section of the estate, moving at a pace that told her it was something worth moving for. She matched it without asking questions. They came around the end of a long stand of oak and stopped. Ghost was in the clearing ahead of them. That was not unusual. Ghost moved through the estate as he chose, and it was not uncommon for them to encounter him during site visits. What was unusual was what he was doing. He was sitting, facing them, about 30 feet away. This in itself was normal. He often sat and watched them when they were working in the estate together. But he had something beside him. She looked more carefully. It was a stick, a short, heavy piece of fallen branch, about the length of her forearm. It was sitting on the ground in front of his left paw, where he had clearly placed or pushed it. As they watched, he looked at the stick. Then he looked at them. Then he looked at the stick again. Ethan made a quiet sound beside her, something between a breath and a word that did not quite resolve. She watched Ghost. Ghost stood up. He picked up the stick in his mouth. He walked 6 steps toward them and set it down on the ground at approximately halfway between himself and them. Then he went back to where he had been, sat down, and looked at them expectantly. The woodland was completely quiet. She was aware of Ethan beside her, not moving. She was aware of the quality of the light in the clearing, thin and white, winter light, making everything very clear. She was aware of Ghost's amber eyes going between them and the stick with the patient exactness of an animal who has decided what he wants to communicate and is waiting for the message to land. He wanted them to come forward, not individually. He had not placed the stick in front of one of them and then looked at the other. He had placed it in front of both of them and was looking at both of them. She felt the edge of something very large in a very small moment. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at Ghost. His expression was, she tried to find the right word and could not exactly. It was open. It was the expression of someone looking at something they love very much and did not expect, and it was also, very briefly, the expression of someone looking at something they hoped for and did not quite dare. She looked back at Ghost. Ghost looked at the stick. She walked forward. She went slowly, because with Ghost speed was always secondary to intent, and she kept her eyes soft and her body at an unthreatening angle, and she walked until she was 6 feet from the stick, and then she stopped. She heard Ethan walk behind her. He came up beside her and stopped. They were standing together, in the middle of the clearing, 8 feet from Ghost. Ghost looked at them for a long moment. Then he lay down, put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. The clearing was quiet and bright. She stood in it beside Ethan Blackwood and did not speak and did not move, and she thought about all the things that an animal can perceive that humans cannot articulate. The way they read the space between people, the quality of attention, the particular signature of two people who have been working alongside each other for 4 weeks and have been dancing around something with very careful footwork. Ghost had, apparently, formed his own view. After a long moment, Ethan said, very quietly, "He's never done that before." "No," she said, "I imagine not." Another moment. "What do you think he means?" Ethan said. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I think he means that he's decided we belong to the same place." Ethan was quiet beside her for what felt like a long time. "Do you think he's right?" he said. She looked at Ghost, chin on paws, eyes closed, the winter light on his silver coat, the woodland around him deep and old and at rest. She thought about the drive along the valley road on Wednesday mornings. She thought about the gill and the stream, and the kestrel, and the 300-year oak. She thought about a consultation report that was growing longer than she had intended, because every section opened another question she wanted to investigate, and she had not yet fully examined why the questions kept multiplying. She thought about the drawer. "I think," she said carefully, "that there are things worth taking time over." He looked at her then, not quickly. He turned and looked at her the way he did everything, with the full weight of his attention, and she met it. "I agree," he said. Ghost did not open his eyes. The clearing was quiet. They stood in it together for another few minutes, not saying anything, in the particular silence of two people who have understood something and are taking a moment before the next thing begins. Then the radio on Ethan's belt crackled, one of the rangers, something routine, and he answered it, briefly, and the ordinary work of the estate resumed around them, and they walked back toward the main house together. She worked through the afternoon, finishing the section of the ecological report, and they talked through the findings over the coffee he had made, and by 5 o'clock the light was going and she was packing up her laptop. He walked her to her car. She drove down the estate lane in the early dark, and the road was clear and cold, and the sky above the valley was the particular deep color of a winter evening, that is neither blue nor black, but something in between. She drove past the point where she usually turned toward the main road, and then, without particularly deciding to, pulled over in the wide verge and stopped the engine. She sat for a moment. She thought about the stick in the middle of the clearing, and Ghost's amber eyes going between them with that patient, specific quality of communication. She thought about Ethan's voice saying, "Do you think he's right?" She thought about what it meant to build something over a long time, carefully, and what it meant to recognize when someone else had been doing the same thing, in the same way, in the same direction, and what happened when those two things were in proximity to each other. She sat in the dark in the verge with the engine off and let herself think it clearly. Then she turned the engine on and drove home. She did not make any decisions that night. She was not that kind of person. She did not rush conclusions the way some people did, compelled by the shape of a feeling into a declaration before the feeling had time to be tested. She let things develop at the rate they developed. She had learned, over a long time, that the things worth having could bear the weight of patience. But she was honest with herself. She was honest that on the Wednesday morning drives along the valley road she had been paying attention to more than the estate. She was honest that the drawer had been getting fuller, and that she had noticed this. She was honest that when Ghost had placed the stick in the middle of the clearing and looked at both of them with that settled, certain gaze, she had felt something open in her that she had been keeping carefully managed. She did not act on any of it that night. She went home and fed her cat, and wrote up her notes and went to bed. But in the morning, when Ethan sent an email about a question regarding the species survey, a practical, professional email with a specific question about methodology, she answered the question, and then added, at the bottom, something she had not planned. There is a wildlife trust lecture in the county town on Friday evening. A researcher presenting on corridor connectivity for large predators in fragmented landscapes. I think it would be relevant to the project. If you're free, it might be worth attending. She read it back. She sent it. She waited. The reply came 40 minutes later. It said, "I'm free Friday. What time does it start?" She wrote back the time and the address and told him she would see him there. Then she closed her email and went back to work, and the ordinary morning went on around her, and she found she was smiling in the way a person smiles when something has moved forward, and they can feel that it is the right direction. Careful, she reminded herself. Patient. But yes. The lecture was good. The researcher, a woman named Helen Cross from a university in the north, spoke for 50 minutes about the movement patterns of large predators across managed landscapes and the specific conditions required for a population corridor to function, rather than merely exist on paper. She had slides full of data and a way of presenting it that was clear and specific and frequently surprising, and Nadia found herself taking notes in the margins of her program. Ethan sat beside her and also took notes. On actual paper. She had not expected this, and was pleased by it in a way she recognized as disproportionate. They talked to Helen Cross for 20 minutes after the lecture, while other attendees milled around them with drinks they had collected from the table at the back of the room. The conversation moved quickly. Helen had questions about the Blackwood Ridge corridor plan, and Nadia had questions about Helen's methodology, and Ethan had questions about the legal and welfare framework for introducing a second animal into an established range. And Helen turned out to be exactly the right person to ask, because she had published on this specific issue 2 years ago, and had views about the regulatory gap that were entirely aligned with Ethan's practical experience of it. She gave them both her card and said she would be glad to correspond further. They got their coats and went out into the cold. The county town was small and quiet on a Friday night in November, the street nearly empty, the pubs showing yellow light through their windows, the market square frost-touched and still. Their breath made pale shapes in the air as they walked toward the car park at the far end of the square. "She knows Francis Dunn," Nadia said. "I noticed that too. She mentioned a project in the Scottish borders that I want to look up. The corridor design there is similar to what we're planning. There might be useful precedent. I'll look it up this weekend." He paused. "If you send me the details, I'll send them tonight." They walked in the quiet for a moment. The square was very old. The buildings around it were the kind that had been built in different centuries with different materials, and had nonetheless settled into a coherent whole, the way places do when they have had time enough. "The report," she said. "First 2 sections should be with you by the end of next week. I know you said that already." "I did," she agreed. She was aware of how this sounded. She was not usually a person who repeated herself. They had reached the car park. Her car was near the entrance. His was further back. She could see it from here. She stopped. "Friday evenings," she said. "Or whichever evening works. There's usually something going on in the county. Lectures, surveys, that kind of thing. If you wanted to." She stopped. She was not being unclear. She had simply stopped halfway through a sentence that was going somewhere she was deciding, in real time, to let it go. Ethan was looking at her. Not in the way of someone waiting to see what came next. In the way of someone who already knew, and was giving her the time to say it. "If you wanted to come along to some of them," she said, "for the project, it would be useful context." He looked at her for a moment. "For the project," he said. "And for whatever else," she said. It was quiet. The frost was settling on the stones of the square, very faint, just visible in the orange light from the shop fronts. He said, "What time next Friday?" She looked at him. She thought about 4 weeks of Wednesday mornings, and the Gill and the Oak and Ghost sitting in the clearing, with his chin on his paws, and his amber eyes closed, and the stick on the ground in front of them. She thought about what it meant that she had driven past her turning, and pulled over in the Verge that evening, and sat in the dark with the engine off, because something had moved in her, and she had needed a moment with it. She thought about everything she had been patient about. "7, she said. "I'll meet you there," he said. She nodded. She got her keys out of her bag. "Good lecture," she said. "Very good." She unlocked her car. "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night, Nadia," he said. She got in and started the engine, and it started on the first try, as it had for every single journey since Alan fixed the starter motor 6 weeks ago. She drove out of the car park and into the street and through the town and out onto the valley road, and the night was cold and still, and the stars were bright above the open farmland on either side. She did not pull over. She drove straight home, through the clear November dark, all the way to the end of the lane, and she parked and sat for one moment with the engine off before going in. Just one moment. Not because she was uncertain. The opposite, exactly. Then she went inside. The cat was on the sofa. She fed him and made tea, and sat at her desk and wrote up the evening, and sent Ethan the links to the Scottish Borders Project and the Helen Cross paper she wanted him to read. His reply came at 11, after she had gone to bed. She read it in the morning. It said, "Good reading. I've forwarded the corridor study to Davies. There's something in the legal framework section I want him to see. See you Wednesday." She read it twice and put the phone down on the bedside table and lay there for a moment in the morning light, with the cat on the end of the bed and the birds starting outside in the way they did when the world was deciding to begin again. Wednesday, she thought. She got up. The last weeks of November moved differently. Nadia was aware of this, but she did not overanalyze it, because overanalyzing good things had a tendency to reduce them, and she was too experienced to make that mistake. She let the weeks be what they were, productive and full and occasionally surprising, and she attended to her work with the same focus she always brought to it, and she was honest with herself about the fact that Wednesday was her favorite day of the week. The ecological report was building into something she was genuinely proud of. She had not expected that. She had expected a solid professional piece of work, accurate and well documented, of use to the consultation brief. What it was becoming was something more, a piece of analysis that connected the estate's existing biodiversity to the potential of the expanded landscape in a way that told a story she found compelling, not just professionally, but as a person who cared about wild places. She mentioned this to Ethan on a Wednesday in late November, standing in the northern section of the estate where the ground began to rise toward the ridge. "The connectivity model," she said. "When I ran it with the northern land included, the outcome surprised me." In what way? The viable habitat for a second large predator in a connected corridor isn't just possible. It's almost exactly optimal. The terrain, the existing prey base, the cover quality. It maps almost identically to the best examples in the literature. She paused. "I've been doing this work for 11 years, and I've done 3 rewilding corridor assessments. They've all been good pieces of land. This is different." He was looking at the ridge. "You've chosen very well," she said. "Or the land chose well. Both." "My grandfather used to say, 'The land knows what it wants,'" Ethan said. He meant it practically, not mystically. That if you stop imposing on it and start observing it, it will show you what it is capable of. He was right. He often was. He looked at her. "I couldn't see it clearly for a long time. I had the vision for what I wanted to build, but I couldn't see the full scope of what the land was already doing while I was building it. You showed me that." She held his gaze for a moment. "The report will show you," she said, "with documentation. That's not what I meant." She knew that. They walked on. Ghost joined them, briefly, in the middle section of the estate, appearing from the tree line to their right without any announcement, the way he always did, as though he had been walking alongside them for some time and had simply become visible. He walked parallel to them for about 10 minutes, staying in the edge of the trees, and then he peeled away and vanished again. "He does that more when you're here," Ethan said. "I've noticed. He doesn't usually accompany people through the estate. He watches from a distance. He's including us in his circuit," she said. "He's decided we're part of the territory." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is that a wolf thing?" he said. "It's a ghost thing, specifically, but yes, it's a statement of acceptance. He's showing you that he considers this arrangement." She searched for the right word. "Satisfactory." "High praise," Ethan said. "From him? Yes." They walked in the good quiet that had become natural to them over weeks of doing this together, moving through the estate, covering ground, working out loud side by side in the way that happened when two people have fallen into a functional ease with each other. She had worked alongside a lot of people in her career. She had rarely fallen into this kind of ease, so quickly, or so completely, and she had not looked too hard at why, because she already knew why, and the knowledge was enough. He made her lunch on that Wednesday. He had not done this before. The first 3 weeks she had brought sandwiches. The 4th week there had been a pie on the kitchen table when they came in from the morning survey, with a note from his part-time housekeeper explaining that she had left extra, and they had eaten it with the maps spread between them on the table. This week there was no housekeeper note, and the kitchen smelled of soup when they came in, and he took 2 bowls from the cupboard without ceremony. She sat down at the table and looked at the maps, and the soup arrived. "You didn't mention you were doing this," she said. "I didn't think it needed announcing." She looked at the soup. It was very good soup. She told him so. "My grandfather's recipe," he said, and that was all he said about it. They ate and worked, and the afternoon ran into the early dark of late November, and she packed up the laptop and the data kit, and they stood in the hall. "The final section of the report," she said. 2 weeks. "I know. The consultation will formally end when I submit it." He looked at her. "I know that too," he said. A silence. She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks, about what the end of the formal consultation meant and what came after it. She had been patient, and she had been careful, and she had let things develop at the rate they developed, and they had developed into something that she was not going to pretend she did not recognize. "There are other projects," she said. "The Northern Land, when it comes in. The second wolf assessment, when you're ready to pursue it." "Yes," he said. "There are. Those would require continued professional involvement." "They would. I would want to be involved." He was quiet for a moment. "The professional involvement," he said carefully, "and the other kind." She looked at him. "Are they the same conversation?" he said, "or 2 different ones?" She thought about how to answer that. "I think," she said, "that they're 2 threads of the same thing, and I don't think pulling them apart would make either of them work better." He was looking at her with the full, direct attention that she had found, over weeks, to be one of the most consistently reliable things about him. "Friday evenings," he said. "Yes. And Wednesdays. And whatever other days the work requires," she said, "which I expect will be many." Something moved in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the foundation of one. A quiet, precise shift in his face that she had learned, over weeks, to read. "The report," he said. 2 weeks, she said. "And after that?" "And after that," she agreed. She picked up her kit. He opened the door. She went out into the cold, and he stood in the light of the doorway and watched her cross the yard to her car, and she felt his attention on her back the whole way. She opened the car door and turned back. He was still standing there. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening, Nadia," he said. She got in and drove. The valley road was very dark and very clear, and she kept the window open a crack because the cold air felt clean and necessary, and she drove the 12 miles home with the particular feeling of a person who has been moving toward something for a long time and can see, now, that it is close. Not rushed, just close. The countryside moved around her in the dark, fields and stone walls and the occasional farmhouse light, and somewhere in the estate behind her, a wolf was walking the boundary of his land in the November night, his breath making clouds in the cold air, his paws finding the paths he knew without needing to look, as certain of his ground as a creature can be. She drove. The gate was behind her. Everything else was ahead. She had always known how to be patient with the things that mattered. She had also always known when patience had done its work. The road went on, and she followed it, steady and clear-eyed, into what came next.